In less than 5 years' time, all 3 members of the Harrison family were killed individually under mysterious circumstances in the same family home. What started off as police believing the deaths were due to natural causes, investigations would soon reveal a disturbing, sinister truth. 18-year-old Melissa Merritt met 27-year-old Caleb Harrison when she began working at My Favorite Doll in 2000, not long after she had graduated high school. The pair were inseparable early on, and soon Caleb was driving Melissa to and from work and spending every lunch break together. Towards the end of that year, Caleb had a death in the family, and Melissa, being the loving girlfriend she was, wanted to support him at the funeral. She didn't know whether her boss would allow this, so instead of putting in a formal request for a day off, Melissa left them a message saying she was attending a funeral that day. By the time Melissa got back to work, she was unceremoniously fired. Caleb, in solidarity, quit his position right then and there, and they left together. Caleb and Melissa continued dating for the next few years before they got married and welcomed 2 children, a son and a daughter. While Caleb was a good father to his children, the marriage between him and Melissa was a tumultuous one. Caleb spent 3 nights in jail after hitting Melissa during a particularly violent argument in 2005. After this incident, they split, and he moved back in with his parents, Bridget and Bill Harrison. In mid-2005, Caleb was invited to a keg party, but drinking would go against the conditions of his release from jail. He took his mother's car and 3 friends, telling them he would be their driver for the evening, but alcohol had long been a crutch for Caleb. While he was able to handle a few beers after getting off his construction job shift, hard liquor was another animal. Once Caleb arrived, he decided 1 drink wouldn't hurt. 1 soon turned into 2, and by the time his friends wanted to leave, Caleb was severely intoxicated. Caleb got into the driver's seat of his mother's car and invited his friends to get in. Seeing how drunk he was, they declined his offer and decided to walk home. Caleb took off down Derry Road. Travelling in the opposite direction was a cab driven by Michael Raymond with 4 passengers. As the cars were nearing each other, Caleb drifted into the cab's path and collided head-on with the vehicle travelling at 100 kilometers per hour. The resulting crash was catastrophic. Michael Raymond died instantly. 2 of the passengers were able to climb out as the vehicles went up in flames. They watched in horror as their friends' seemingly lifeless bodies were slumped over, but neighbours who had heard the accident ran outside and were able to pull the 2 out to safety. One of them had been scalped, while the other had multiple broken bones and a fractured spine. Caleb's friends, who were walking home, had heard the crash and rushed to see what happened. There, they saw the car they had wisely not entered moments ago, with Caleb still inside. His friends saved him that day, and Caleb escaped with relatively minor injuries compared to what he inflicted on others. Following the crash, Caleb was arrested and charged with driving under the influence and causing death and bodily harm. He posted bail, but was kept on house arrest at his parents' home in Mississauga, Bridget and Bill. Bridget and Bill met in the 60s when she was acting in a play at the Stratford Festival. Bill was working in the costume department at the time. They married in 1969 and moved to Mississauga, where they would live for the next 30-plus years. Bridget was a teacher who worked her way up to becoming a principal, while Bill served as an executive for Sobeys. Both of the Harrisons were loved in the community, with Bill always taking the time to coach the local Little League baseball team. They wanted desperately to have a family of their own, but when they were unable to conceive naturally, they adopted 6-month-old Caleb in 1973. Bill and Bridget took to parenting like fish to water, with Bill frequently referring to his son as his best friend. By late 2005, Caleb was yet to stand trial for the accident he had caused. His defense lawyer had been unavailable to represent him for a few months, and then, as luck would have it, when he was ready, the judge presiding over the case fell ill. The trial was postponed a year, but when the time rolled around, Caleb's lawyer was again not available. Melissa had been horrified by the news of what her former partner did, and believed it was a prime example of the type of behaviour that makes someone an unfit father. Melissa wanted sole custody of the children, but a judge ordered that they would share custody. While they shared differing views on their parenting, One thing Caleb and Melissa had both done was move on to new relationships. Caleb was dating mother of two, Corinda McEwen. Caleb's parents were very welcoming to Corinda, and she grew particularly close to Bridget. Melissa began dating part-time security guard Christopher Fattore. Despite Caleb and Melissa not yet being formally divorced, she and Christopher held a commitment ceremony where they reaffirmed their love and devotion for each other. A few months later, they welcomed a little girl into the family. Christopher was said to adore Melissa and took a protective role over her and her children. With that desire to protect her came a deep dislike for Caleb. This led him to create a Facebook page focusing on getting more awareness of the crimes Caleb committed in the hope it would lead to a deserving punishment. "This man has gotten away with too much already in his life," one post read. "It can't keep happening." This sort of behavior on Christopher's behalf only added fuel to an already raging fire. Melissa accused Caleb of not treating their children right, though when she was asked for further proof or evidence, she was often unable to provide such. As the tension between the sides increased, Melissa made the decision to keep her children from going over to the Harrisons after claiming her son had been hit by his grandparents. It seemed in Melissa's mind she was doing the right thing and protecting her children from harm. The law viewed the situation differently, and a judge swiftly intervened and reiterated that Caleb and Melissa were to share custody. A clause was added that said the authorities should be contacted should this incident repeat itself in the future. When Caleb's trial finally rolled around, Melissa and Christopher made their presence known by sitting in the back row of the court row on every occasion they could. They also made faces at Bridget and Bill, and while Caleb was happy to brush this off as childish behaviour, Bridget was concerned. The verdict came in on March 9, 2009, and Caleb was found guilty of impaired driving and 3 counts of impaired driving, resulting in grievous bodily harm. He was handed an 18-month prison sentence. This could have meant Christopher and Melissa had some peace in the custody department, but Bridget and Bill immediately sought to take over Caleb's custody rights. A judge soon granted their request. While it seemed something had gone their way, soon the Harrisons' lives would be rocked by a great tragedy. On April 16th, Bridget arrived home after dark from a late meeting to find the house was clouded in an eerie silence. She called out to Bill, telling him she was home, but received no response. The reason for this became clear moments later. Bill was on the bathroom floor and wasn't breathing. Bridget made a desperate call to 911, and emergency personnel were soon on the scene. It seemed like Bill had died suddenly after walking to the bathroom with his daily medication. A non-forensic autopsy deemed Bill's death a result of cardiac arrhythmia. This was despite a fractured sternum and bruising to his upper body. But in the eyes of the medical world, the case was closed. Bill, a fit 64-year-old, had collapsed and died in the bathroom that night, with the door locked behind him. Following the findings, Bill's body was cremated. All the while, Bridget felt something was deeply wrong with the entire situation, a feeling that was greatly intensified by the fact that Melissa, Christopher, and the children had packed up their lives and disappeared on the same day Bill died. In a matter of weeks, everything Bridget held dearest was ripped away from her. Her son was in prison, her husband had died, and her grandchildren were missing. She couldn't shake the feeling of Melissa's involvement due to the suspicious timing of their disappearing act, and felt the authorities had this whole thing wrong when they were so quick to rule Bill's death as natural causes. There was nothing she could do to get her husband back, but Bridget wasn't about to give up on her grandchildren. The very day after she said goodbye to Bill at his funeral, Bridget arrived at court and petitioned a judge to grant her temporary sole custody of her grandchildren. Her request was granted, but didn't change the fact that she didn't know where they were. The authorities were involved and spent the next 2 months trying to find a single trace of Melissa, Christopher, or the children, without success. Caleb was released in mid-June, only 3 months into his sentence. He was placed on parole and moved back in with his mother. Over in Nova Scotia, Melissa and Christopher were living the quiet life in the town of Londonderry, home to only 200 residents. Now they were free to raise their children how they wanted without being inconvenienced by custody agreements and clashes. It was in Londonderry that Melissa had her 4th child, her second fathered by Christopher. Unfortunately for them, this fairy tale came to a rude ending when Christopher's real identity was exposed, and Melissa was then arrested in late November 2009. She was charged with parental kidnapping. Melissa was released on bail, but this was on the condition that she was not allowed any contact with Caleb or their children. Now, Melissa was awaiting trial and being kept separate from her children. It was something she could stand for only so long. On April 10, 2010, Melissa and Christopher were seen outside the Harrison home. This went directly against Melissa's bail conditions and meant she was rearrested. Melissa posted bail the same day and returned home to Christopher. Bridget, at least, had her son and grandchildren home on the anniversary of her husband's death, which would have provided a small comfort to her broken heart. She had been working hard on a victim impact statement that she was going to read at Melissa's trial, which was set for April 22nd. In it, Bridget began with the loss of her husband and highlighted the fact that she does not believe in coincidences. This was going to be Bridget's moment in court, but she never made it. On April 21st, 2010, Bridget dropped Caleb off at work and her grandchildren at school before carrying on home. She was due in court the next day, where she would read her impact statement. She was feeling ready for it. It was Bridget's grandson who made the discovery that afternoon. Bridget was lying at the bottom of the stairs. As they had been for Bill, emergency services were promptly on the scene, trying to resuscitate Bridget. However, it was too late. Her head rested on the bottom step, and there were visible marks on her face and ear. Bridget's neck was broken, and there was evidence of compression to her throat. She also had broken ribs. She was fully clothed, and her purse and glasses had landed next to her. It seemed Bridget had fallen down the stairs while she was heading outside. When her body was autopsied by the coroner, her death was ruled suspicious, but not ruled a homicide. Caleb made it very clear from the start that investigators needed to be focused on two people and no one else, Melissa and Christopher. Losing his mother and father within 13 months of each other was almost too much for Caleb to bear. He stopped seeing Corinda and began consuming alcohol again. If not for his children, Caleb may not have made it through this time in his life. For the time being, he was given temporary sole custody of the children, which had been transferred from his mother. Melissa could see her children, but only under supervision. After Bridget died, Melissa and Christopher moved their family to Perth County, in Ontario, where they rented a modest farm, and Christopher began work at a poultry factory. It seemed like an idyllic life out in Perth County. The family lived in a modest brick home, had an array of pets and small farm animals, and began focusing on being as self-sufficient as possible. Despite the occasional Google search of Bridget and Bill Harrison's names, the pair wanted to distance themselves from the family. It was Caleb who first offered Melissa unsupervised visits with the children. This marked the start of a cycle where they would spend a week in Perth County and a week in Mississauga. They seemed pretty happy with the arrangement, enjoying their time out on the farm with the half-siblings, and Melissa and Christopher made an effort to take the children on frequent trips out. The peace and quiet they had created for themselves was shattered in the early morning hours of March 1st, 2012, when their house caught fire. Melissa was 5 months pregnant at the time, and though the family got all of their children out safely, the family pets perished in the blaze. They were forced to move into a hotel room. Whether this added a strain that spilled over onto their relationship with Caleb is unclear. Christopher and Melissa moved back to Mississauga, but for unknown reasons, Chris decided to stop Melissa from having unsupervised access to the children. As the months went on, Caleb had been making a real effort to fix his life for the better. He was dating Corinda again and had a job with CMC Electronic, which would offer a steady stream of income, unlike his construction job. He offered to coach the Little League team, following in the steps of his father, and always made sure to spend quality time with his children. Caleb was still battling with the loss of his mother and father, but he was trying to move forward. This would come to a horrifying end on the night of August 22nd. Caleb had taken the children to baseball before he dropped them off with Melissa. He was supposed to be joined by Corinda that night, but she had work to catch up on. They last spoke at 11 p.m. It was clear he had been drinking, and they got into an argument about finances. Once the conversation was over, Caleb turned his phone off and placed it on his bedside table like he always did. He drifted to sleep, blissfully unaware of what would happen hours later. On the morning of August 23rd, Caleb's cleaning lady arrived for her regular shift and began cleaning the home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that day. That was until one of Caleb's colleagues arrived, looking for him at around midday. He had missed work, which was unlike him, but the colleague assumed Caleb may just still be sleeping. He decided to go upstairs and see if he could wake him, but repeated knocks on Caleb's bedroom door went unanswered. Then, Caleb's colleague and housekeeper slowly opened the door, finding him stone cold in his bed. Caleb had no pulse, and it was clear he had been dead for a while at this stage. He marked the third Harrison to die in this same household, but unlike his mother and father's deaths, it was clear that Caleb's passing had been due to no accident. He had died by asphyxiation. Suddenly, a whole new light was shone on the previous deaths of Bridget and Bill Harrison, and soon the authorities were investigating 3 murders. Melissa and Christopher were at the top of the suspect list early on. Officers were assigned to keep tabs on the pair to ensure they didn't skip town again. DNA was recovered under Caleb's fingernails, and a rush analysis proved it was an exact match to Christopher Fattori. Since his DNA was not previously in the system, those officers who were following him managed to retrieve a coffee cup he threw out and get a DNA sample that way. Other forensic evidence soon followed, linking Chris to the crime. Since Caleb was gone, Melissa was given full custody of the children, and once the paperwork was in order, she and Christopher moved back to Nova Scotia. They got to spend a few months away from the reality of what lay in wait back in Mississauga. In January 2014, RCMP officers were accompanied by Detective Phil King to the Fattori's house in Nova Scotia, with arrest warrants in hand. Bill's death was still being investigated, but they felt there was enough evidence to prove the pair were responsible for the murders of Bridget and Caleb. They were cuffed and taken to a local station for questioning.
I didn't like Caleb Harrison. I didn't like the way he treated my kids. I didn't like hearing all the horrific stories. It was an awful family. They treated the children like shit. And I and Melissa had to live with it every day, and I couldn't watch Melissa's attitude and how sorry she was for everything that was going on. And I'm telling you right now that Melissa Merritt did not know anything until after it was done.
What did you do?
I killed Bridget Harrison and Caleb Harrison.
How did you kill Bridget?
I knocked on her door. She opened the door. And pretended to have a letter to give to the children. She refused the letter, so I then forced my way into the house and I attacked her.
What did you do?
I hit her a couple of times. I then proceeded to squeeze her neck. Until she stopped breathing and laid on the floor. I never meant to find him. I never meant to find her. That's not the plan. That's not what I wanted. I figured that someone would come home, or Caleb would come home and find her. I didn't expect for to come to the house. I didn't think that was going to happen.
I know that.
And as for Caleb, I snuck out in the middle of the night. Melissa had no idea. I left, I went there. I got into his house. Proceeded to go up to the bedroom. I hit him in the chest. And when he sprung up, we began to struggle. I threw him into the shelving unit beside his bed. He tried to bribe me with money. I didn't speak to him. I just knocked him to the ground and then proceeded to choke him.
It took 13 hours before Christopher told the detective, "I didn't like Caleb Harrison. In an attempt to divert the blame away from Melissa, I'm telling you right now that Melissa Merritt did not know anything until after it was done," he said. Christopher goes on to admit to murdering Bridget and Caleb Harrison. Despite Christopher's effort to divert attention away from Melissa, the investigators found it implausible that he acted alone. Both of them had formal charges laid against them, and in January 2018, their trial wrapped up, and the jury was called upon to deliver their verdict. On the count of first-degree murder of Caleb Harrison, Christopher Fator and Melissa Merritt were found guilty. Christopher was found guilty of Bridget's murder, but the jury was unable to agree on a decision for Melissa. As for Bill Harrison, Christopher was found not guilty due to insufficient evidence. No charges were laid against Melissa in that case. Both Christopher and Melissa were given life sentences with the possibility of parole after 25 years served. Christopher will serve his sentence at Beaver Creek Institution in Gravenhurst, Ontario, and Melissa will serve hers at Grand Valley Institution for Women in Kitchener. The children now live with family, and Christopher and Melissa are no longer together, after Melissa broke things off and began dating someone she met at her prison. When authorities looked back at how the events unfolded, they found a multitude of mistakes that occurred, preventing Melissa and Christopher from being caught sooner. The autopsies conducted on Bill and Bridget were negligent, to say the least, with the coroner ignoring major signs of trauma that should have signalled foul play was involved. Had that not happened, maybe Caleb would still be alive. Our hearts go out to the families and friends who carry the burden of this tragic loss, especially the children involved. It's through our collective awareness and compassion that we hope to help shed light on these dark corners of our society.